Democratic backsliding is defined as the deterioration or the reduction in various political aspects of democratic governance. Some scholars tend to see it as gradual erosion of political institutions that are important, that are crucial to sustain a democratic regime. Now, democratic backsliding can occur actually at one of three different levels. It could mean reduction that happens in terms of political participation. For instance, political institutions becoming less responsive, less representative. It could refer to a reduction in electoral competition that happens in a country. For instance, an uneven playing field emerging between the ruling party and the opposition parties that makes it increasingly difficult for opposition groups to unseat the government. Or they could happen in terms of a reduction or an erosion in horizontal or vertical accountability. This refers to bureaucracy or military or the civilian government becoming free from accountability, right? Either to their peers, horizontal accountability, or to the voters directly, vertical accountability. Democratic backsliding can happen in all sorts of regimes. So it could mean reversal from a liberal democracy to a diminuted form of democracy. In the scholarship, we tend to call it democracy with adjectives, right? The sort of adjectives that are used to diminuate certain aspects of the democratic regime, for instance, majoritarian democracy, which refers to those regimes where you have elected governments that are unresponsive to various institutions of checks and balances. Could be illiberal democracy, tutelary democracy, right? So a shift from liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy. So that could be one category. Another category is that, of course, some of these illiberal or majoritarian forms of democratic regimes can fall into the authoritarian column. But of course, before these regimes turn into full autocracies or closed autocracies, like the ones that we see in Cuba, North Korea, or China, or maybe even Central Asian republics, they become hybrid regimes. In other words, regimes that combine certain elements of democratic systems, mostly elections, with a set of authoritarian practices. Right? These are what scholars call to be electoral authoritarian regimes. And unfortunately, in recent years, we're seeing these regimes become prevalent, especially in the global south. Now, among electoral authoritarian regimes, some tend to be still competitive, at least competitive in electoral terms. For instance, countries like Turkey, Hungary, Serbia have such competitive authoritarian regimes. Others have become much more hegemonic in the sense that even though you have elections that are held regularly, the ruling party is expected to win these elections. Election results are almost certain to go in the way of the incumbents. Right? So in countries like Venezuela, Russia, and Belarus, we've seen cases like that. So democratic backsliding can happen in any one of these regimes. And it basically results in a gradual, peaceful, it results in an erosion of democratic institutions in a gradual, peaceful fashion. So incremental changes happening over a long period of time. This could mean several months, several years, and in some cases, maybe even a decade. You may not immediately notice the democratic erosion right away, because the changes that occur in any one moment is very gradual, very incremental. So it's like watching the time. If you were to watch it second by second, you don't really notice that the time has passed. But of course, if you stop watching and then 5 hours later you look at the clock, you realize that the time has changed. Democratic backsliding occurs in a similar fashion. If you follow it very closely on a daily basis, you may not notice immediate changes right away, but after a certain period of time, the erosion that happens in political institutions become very clear. Now, democratic backsliding around the globe has actually become quite prevalent in recent years, and the incremental nature of this change is actually rather a novel phenomena, and it's a major shift from the Cold War period, because throughout the Cold War, we've actually seen democratic breakdown occur in single episodes. For instance, democratic regimes collapsed as a result of military coups across the global south. For instance, think of the Turkish context. We've experienced a successive wave of military coups in 1960, 1971, 1980. And of course, after a coup happens, the democratic regime collapses almost overnight, so that you end up with a dramatic shift from a democratic regime to an undemocratic regime. This is not exactly democratic backsliding. It's a total collapse of the democratic regime. Throughout the Cold War, and even in the 1990s, we witnessed, for instance, executive coups. In other words, civilian governments getting help from the military ended up basically eroding the constitutional authority and seized full control, almost completely eliminating the opposition. For instance, think of the Fujimori's autogolpe or self-coup in Peru in early 1990s. Yeltsin in Russia in 1993 bombarded the parliament and basically seized almost total control of the political system. Armenia under Petrosyan, again in the 1990s. Belarus in 1995 similarly experienced an executive takeover by the then president Lukashenko. Right? These are single episodes that experience a total breakdown of the democratic regime. Democratic backsliding is a bit different in the sense that this erosion of democratic institutions happen over a much longer time period, and so these institutions erode in a very gradual manner. Institutions, these political institutions, can become unresponsive. So that they can no longer really address popular issues, resolve political problems in the country or economic problems in the country, and so they decay, they lose popular support. But this does not happen in a single episode. Now, what we have experienced in recent years, however, is a move away from such military coups or executive coups that result in total democratic breakdown after one single episode, a move away from such cases to democratic backsliding. For instance, rather than executive coups, we are noticing what scholars call to be executive aggrandizement. In other words, elected leaders, popularly elected leaders, who come to power, begin to gradually weaken institutions of horizontal accountability, various checks and balances, including obviously the media, the parliament, the judiciary. And after they weaken these political institutions, they capture the state apparatus and use their political power to systematically weaken the opposition so that no other party would be able to unseat them through democratically held elections, the very manner that they came to power. The judicial system in such countries become very politicized, and state resources or public resources are distributed to partisan groups. In other words, groups that support the ruling party, right? So rather than military coups or executive coups that were quite prevalent throughout the Cold War, what we are witnessing over the last 2 decades is a reduction in the number of coups that happen. We still see coups, like in Egypt, like in Myanmar, but their numbers have come down quite substantially. Executive coups also do not really happen widely. Instead, we see executive aggrandizement. Similarly, unlike the Cold War period, during which we experienced electoral fraud in a number of developing countries that had weak political institutions, we instead nowadays see strategic electoral manipulation. In other words, governments do not necessarily resort to electoral fraud. They don't necessarily need to stuff the ballot boxes in order to win the elections, because they already take actions, gradual actions prior to the voting day in order to ensure that they will win those elections, right? So scholars call this as strategic electoral manipulation. Various ruling parties across the global south have systematically tilted the playing field during elections. For instance, many governments, including, for instance, the Turkish case, they enjoy uneven access to media, which they, of course, use disproportionately during the campaign periods. They enjoy disproportionate access to campaign funds, so that they will be able to spend vast amounts of money during election campaigns in order to defeat the opposition candidates. And also the public bureaucracy acts in such a partisan manner that it increasingly works together and roots for the pro-government candidates, obviously at the expense of the opposition. Electoral rules are manipulated. Quite possibly, electoral rules are regularly changed in order to create all sorts of systematic advantages to the ruling party. And if there are violations that happen on the election day, the courts are, because of the erosion of the autonomy or the independence of the judiciary, courts become unresponsive to the accusations of the opposition. Yeah? When these happen systematically, of course, ruling parties can easily expect to win elections against the opposition, such that they don't necessarily need to resort to electoral fraud or massive violence. Right? So, as a result of such changes, what we currently experience, particularly in the global south, is a rapid increase in the number of hybrid regimes. In other words, that regimes that bring together or amalgate certain democratic elements with various aspects of authoritarian regimes. Elections continue to be held, and leaders can still consider themselves to be popularly elected, but these contests, these electoral contests, are increasingly unfair and unfree, creating all sorts of advantages to the incumbents. Now, unfortunately, according to the calculations of the Freedom House, since 2007, we've seen a general decline in the number of democracies around the globe, right? So it's been a systematic backsliding happening, obviously not in every single country, but around the globe, such that the increase in the number of democracies have fallen under the increase in the number of autocratic regimes around the globe since 2007. So we are witnessing a wave of an autocratization process fueled by the democratic backsliding that I briefly explained. Now, this means that we've witnessed the end of the so-called third wave, the third wave of democratization that began in 1974. Since 1974, for the next 3 decades, we've actually witnessed quite a rapid increase in the number of electoral democracies around the globe, many weakly institutionalized regimes. Many poor nations have become democratic during the 1980s, 1990s, and even 2000s. And this process really accelerated with the end of the Cold War, because, of course, with the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union collapsed. And with that, many of the client states that are supported by the Soviet Union also collapsed, and they were replaced by various democratic regimes across Africa, across Eastern Europe, and parts of Latin America. Right? So since 2007, what we've seen around the globe is a reversal of this third wave. So you could sort of treat this as a wave of autocratization happening around the globe. Of course, there are various reasons for this tectonic change, for this massive change that we're experiencing in world politics. 2008-2009 financial crisis was a crucial turning point. It brought havoc to many countries, not just in the developing world, but also among Western countries that have highly developed economies, very sizable financial sectors. In these countries, financial systems were uprooted, and this created massive poverty and fueled a populist backlash around the globe. Obviously, rapid liberalization in world economy, quite possibly going all the way back to the 1980s, created a set of winners and losers. And the losers, their numbers have substantially increased since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. These losers are, of course, losers of the globalization trend, right? They tend to be, on average, low-educated, people with less exportable skills. These are sort of people who are tied to national contexts, who can only speak their own native language, and they feel that they have, relatively speaking, they have lost as a result of these changes. Now, obviously, again, over the last decade, particularly because of a number of civil wars that erupted across the global south, a number of migration waves have engulfed not just the global south, but also the developed world, because, of course, more and more people would like to move from impoverished regions, conflict zones, to more developed countries, right? So as a result of income gaps across countries and regions, we are witnessing a huge trend of migration, which of course generated a nativist backlash, not just in various developing countries, but also across the developed world. Now, as a result of these very structural changes for the last 15 years, together with this democratic backsliding wave, we're witnessing the rise of various populist parties to power, right? Populists have gained electoral prominence around the globe, not just obviously right-wing populist parties, but also left-wing ones as well. These populist leaders have mobilized their base to win elections. And once they win those elections and come to power, they criticize and target the status quo. And every political actor that is supportive of the status quo, including obviously the existing institutions, are victimized, are criminalized by these populists in power. And these populists use these economic or political crises, migration waves, as an excuse to weaken institutions of checks and balances, so that over time they end up with lower levels of horizontal accountability. As this process takes steam, they can easily use their access to power, their access to public resources, to systematically weaken the opposition so that they can stay in power for long periods of time. You know, there are a number of populist leaders like Duterte in Philippines, Modi in India, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, that have really pushed this process very systematically in order to undermine political institutions in their countries and push for democratic backsliding. This is obviously not unique to right-wing populist leaders, because all the populist leaders that I've specified so far tend to fall under the category of right-wing populism, right? They use either ethnic solidarity or religious values in order to push for a populist agenda. But we also have seen a similar trend under left-wing populist leaders. Their numbers are much smaller, but nonetheless, their damage on democratic institutions have been also quite worrisome, quite substantial. For instance, Chavez or Maduro in Venezuela, I can very easily count, maybe to a certain extent, Kirchner in Argentina in late 2000s, early 2010s, right? So under various populist leaders, we've seen similar tactics being employed by governments to push for this process. Now, to give one clear example from the Turkish context, which is where I'm from, the current ruling party, a Justice and Development Party, have come to power through free and fair elections in 2002. At the time, Turkey had what scholars call to be tutelary democracy. In other words, elections were held regularly, but the elected officials were constrained in terms of promoting their political agenda by a number of tutelary actors, such as the military, such as the Constitutional Court. But after AKP won the 2002 elections and then went on to win re-election in 2007, they expanded their popular support, and used this electoral support, their base, to target these tutelary actors. And gradually, the regime turned into a majoritarian democracy. However, after that point, so quite possibly starting with 2007 and onwards, AKP went on to capture state institutions, and rather than push for a liberal democracy, it basically eroded institutions of checks and balances, such that Turkey gradually regressed to a competitive authoritarian regime. And I think we still are experiencing such a case in the Turkish context. We have elections that are held regularly, but these elections are neither free nor fair, because the ruling party controls all state institutions almost completely and governs them in a very partisan manner. It awards its supporters as well as punishing its opponents. It systematically targets its critics. in the education sector, in the media. It has curtailed the democratic space available to opposition politicians to criticize the government, as a result of which there is an uneven playing field in the country. Now, this was just one example, but I think the Turkish case is quite indicative of how populists, after winning elections and coming to power, gradually undermine democratic institutions, in some cases to the point of pushing for a breakdown. I think in a number of countries, ranging from Brazil to Hungary, to Poland, to Philippines, to India, to Venezuela, we've seen a similar process. Now, in conclusion, I want to end with an optimistic note, because I think we are quite possibly approaching the end of this wave of autocratization around the globe. The pandemic is going to substantially change the situation, obviously, around the globe, but particularly in these cases, because the populist governments that I've mentioned in this video have, without exception, turned out to do a terrible job in managing the pandemic. They have failed to resolve the economic crisis generated by the pandemic. They have failed to uphold public health for their people, and basically in India, in Brazil, in Turkey, the numbers have really, the case numbers have really gone up quite substantially. And these populist governments, because they have undermined state capacity, because they don't trust scientists, they don't really work with political institutions, because they target the opposition, they've done a much more terrible job compared to non-populist governments, democratic or authoritarian. And we may begin to see an erosion of their popular base. In India, we've seen early signs of that. Modi just recently lost a couple of state elections, and this may really be a warning sign for him. Bolsonaro, quite possibly next year in the Brazilian presidential elections, may lose that to Lula. Trump, right, he comes from a developed country, but was similarly a right-wing populist leader targeting political institutions. Democratic backsliding in the US did not really accelerate to the point that we see in many countries in the global south, but nonetheless, it did occur even in the US, and Trump, quite possibly because of its poor management of the pandemic, ended up losing the 2020 presidential elections. Right? So we may be on the verge of a new wave emerging with these populists losing elections. In order for that outcome to happen, of course, the opposition needs to be very vigilant and come up with a very determined, comprehensive strategy to defeat these populists in the elections, because, of course, they face an uneven playing field. That's why they need to coordinate their actions and work in tandem with other opposition actors, quite possibly seek electoral alliances so that they will be able to unseat these populist governments. They need to expand their party capacity so that they will be able to run effective campaigns and also defend the ballot boxes so that no electoral irregularities would take place in these elections. And then we have seen in a number of countries, ranging from India to Hungary to Turkey, at least at the local level, opposition winning, scoring some electoral victories, which, if the current trend continues, may also happen at the national level, putting an end to this sustained process of democratic backsliding.